Two rising powers with expansionist ambitions meet in Berlin. The German capital watches as the emissaries from Asia arrive at the Third Reich Chancellery. There, Adolf Hitler himself awaits representatives of the powerful Empire of Japan to seal a pact. The signing would make them allies, but that friendship was nothing more than a mirage. The Führer's plans had hidden agendas, where loyalty was a mere illusion. War was about to break out, and it would be accompanied by betrayals. In this new installment of military history, we delve into the fragile alliance of Nazis and Japanese, what they thought of each other, why they united for a common purpose, and how distrust transformed into a cruel stab in the back. On November 25, 1936, representatives of Germany and Japan faced each other in a diplomatically rigid confrontation. The objective was to sign a pact that, in theory, would seal an alliance against the growing threat of the Soviet Union. This treaty, known as the Agreement Against the Communist International, reflected a shared vision of expansion and domination. However, it also marked the beginning of a series of betrayals and disagreements that, in turn, would mark the course of World War II. Despite its apparent strength, the bond between Berlin and Tokyo was more fragile than many might think. Although the two countries had many political and military affinities, the reality is that they never behaved as true allies. Adolf Hitler viewed the Japanese with contempt and fear. For him, they were a people incapable of innovating on their own, destined to follow in the footsteps of the Aryan race or fall into decline. But when geopolitics imposed its rules, the Führer was forced to swallow his words and feign courtesy. Despite his racism, he grudgingly admired the ferocity of the Japanese soldiers. Thus was born the myth of the honorary Aryans, even though Asians were never treated as equals by the Third Reich. Thus, the alliance was a pact based on hypocrisy. The Nazis saw the Japanese as a necessary evil, a partner they would use as long as it served their interests. Meanwhile, in the midst of the process of modernization and opening up to the West, the Asians based their own civil code on the German model. They respected and admired them. They also used the organization of the Prussian army as an example to structure the imperial troops. However, beyond the two having very different visions, the fundamental point of their alliance was the existence of a common enemy, Russia. Following victory in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, Tokyo consolidated its position as an emerging power. Even so, tensions with the Soviet Union remained simmering for decades. Nazi ideology, with its marked anti-communism, made Germany the ideal partner for the Empire of the Rising Sun. However, what initially seemed destined to be a firm friendship soon showed signs of cracks. The rift began when Japan, convinced that Hitler would support it, increased hostilities along the Soviet border. During the massacre in China, the Japanese had conquered the region of Manchuria. There they formed a state called Manchukuo, governed by Tokyo. In 1932, they delimited their borders along the Khalkha River. This caused tensions with not just one, but two neighbors. To the north lay the main objective: the abundant natural resources of Siberia and the Soviet Far East. But to the west, there were also problems, as Mongolia disagreed with the territorial boundaries that had been established. In 1936, the Russians and Mongolians signed a mutual cooperation agreement. This obligated each party to come to the aid of the other in the event of aggression by a third party. Thus, the growing rivalry with the Soviet Union led the Empire of Japan to end up fighting against the forces of both countries. The first time was in 1938 at the Battle of Lake Khasan on Russian soil. There was no clear winner, and the confrontation ended in what was considered a draw. However, on the night of May 10, 1939, a new crossing began. And this time, the outcome would be very different. About 80 Mongolian People's Army cavalrymen crossed the border into Manchukuo under the pretext of foraging for their horses. At dawn, they were spotted by Japanese cavalrymen who charged the intruders and drove them back, causing heavy casualties. But that was only the beginning. The imperial government demanded an apology that never came and decided to act accordingly. They were going to show their neighbors who they were messing with. But not everything turned out as they imagined. During June and August 1939, the Japanese mobilized 75,000 men, 135 tanks, and about 250 aircraft across the Khalkha River. However, on the other side were not only Mongolian warriors. The Soviet Union had arrived with reinforcements, deploying 57,000 troops, 500 tanks, and 800 aircraft. The battle was brutal. With the battlefield stained with blood, the Japanese were convinced that the Nazi forces would soon unite to fight a common enemy. However, they were once again mistaken. Hitler and his men never arrived, and the Imperial Army suffered one of its worst military defeats in history. But as if this were not enough, another blow was about to strike Tokyo. While its troops were being massacred fighting the Soviet leaders' soldiers in Europe, the beginning of another war was brewing. One that would cover the entire world in its shadow. Behind it stood the Führer, who, far from aiding his military partner, focused on his own interests. At the same time that the Asians were healing their wounds, and were forced to reconsider their approach to war, they were shaken by the unexpected. Without warning or consultation, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact on August 23, 1939. Just days after the brutal battle at Khalkha. For Japan, this represented a blatant betrayal by its supposed ally, which not only abandoned its anti-communist commitment, but also established secret agreements to divide territories in Eastern Europe. the news of the so-called Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was greeted with dismay in Tokyo. Japanese diplomacy was left in an awkward position and had to rethink its strategies. As a result, the conflict with the Soviet Union froze, and Japan began to turn its attention towards Southeast Asia and the Pacific. However, Japan wasn't the only one surprised by Hitler and Stalin's rapprochement. The non-aggression pact perplexed the other Western powers, who considered it unnatural from the Nazi point of view. However, the reason for this strange union could be explained by the needs of each signatory. On the one hand, the Third Reich needed to ensure peace on the Eastern Front for the duration of the war that was about to break out. On the other, the Soviets were looking for a powerful ally to break out of international isolation, and they also didn't want to confront the fearsome Germany. Adolf Hitler's success in Western Europe had a profound impact on Japan. Asians saw how the Nazis' blitzkrieg contrasted with their situation, and they found themselves at a standstill in their incursion into China. However, Tokyo refused to resign itself to its expansionist vision and sought to emulate the Germans despite the betrayal. On September 22, 1940, while France was occupied by the forces of the Third Reich, the Imperial Japanese Army invaded French Indochina. Thus began Japan's conquest of the region under the guise of liberating Southeast Asia from European colonial rule. The reality was that its intention to expand into the Soviet Union had been a failure. But by shifting the focus of its war strategy, it was also able to put the German betrayal behind it and signed another agreement in Berlin on September 27, 1940. This time, both powers added Italy to form the Tripartite Pact, formalizing the existing cooperation and finally shaping the Axis. Everything seemed to indicate that the resentments had disappeared. But what Hitler didn't know was that a new betrayal was brewing behind his back. While World War II progressed on various fronts, Japanese Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka was negotiating the signing of a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. The agreement was finally reached in April 1941, repeating what had already happened, but in reverse. By then, the Führer and his generals were finalizing preparations for Operation Barbarossa. A full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union launched on June 22nd of that same year. The Empire of Japan had not been informed, nor had it been offered the opportunity to participate in a joint mission. The lack of coordination, as well as the suspicion that existed between the two powers, became increasingly evident. And in December 1941, it found a new expression: the attack on Pearl Harbor. The bombing of the U.S. naval base caused the American giant to officially enter the war, radically changing the fate of the conflict. Washington's need to focus its resources on a battle in the Pacific favored the Nazis. This way, it would not provide support to the British or Soviets to fight Germany on the European fronts. Still, Hitler would need Japan's help to defeat Stalin, as the Red Army vehemently resisted. For this reason, the Führer decided to make a gesture toward his ally and declared war on the Americans. He hoped that with this support, Tokyo would break its agreement with the Soviets and join the fight from Siberia to divide the opposing troops. However, that never happened. It is true that for a moment in 1942, the war seemed to be tilting in favor of the Axis. German tanks advanced toward the Caucasus and the Middle East, while the Japanese Navy advanced into the waters of Australia and India. But what sounded like an imminent victory turned out to be just a mirage. The Third Reich was trapped in the devastating Russian winter at Stalingrad, where its Sixth Army was annihilated. Meanwhile, Japan suffered irretrievable losses in the Pacific after the Battle of Midway. The lack of coordination, the depletion of resources, and the industrial superiority of the Allies marked the beginning of the end for the German-Japanese Union. By 1945, the Axis was on the verge of collapse. Germany fell in May, while Japan held out until August, when the devastating atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki sealed its surrender. The Soviet Union, which until then had maintained relative peace with the Japanese, broke the non-aggression pact in its final days and launched an invasion of Manchuria, contributing to the final surrender of the empire. Thus ended an alliance that, despite its apparent strength, never consolidated into true military cooperation. The history of Germany and Japan in World War II was not that of two inseparable partners, but of two nations with distinct ambitions that, despite sharing enemies, never managed to trust each other. And now, after exploring the conflictive relationship between these two powers in the deadliest war in history, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for joining us. See you in the next installment of Military History.